It's August 16th, 2026. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from, and I'm genuinely excited about today's video because we're talking about something that's been building for months and just took a massive step forward. 90 miles off the coast of Florida, there's a communist government that's been running on fumes, literally, and the United States military has been quietly stacking the deck for what could be the next major move in the Western Hemisphere. Just 2 days ago, the Secretary of War stood in Panama and told reporters, flat out, that every option is on the table when it comes to Cuba, including military ones. Not, we're monitoring the situation. Not, we hope for a diplomatic solution. Every option, including military ones. That's a sentence you don't say by accident. So here's what we're covering today. We've got a marine and sailor buildup in the Caribbean that's been quietly growing for months. We've got a fuel and economic blockade that's been squeezing Havana since January. And it's working in a way that almost nobody expected this fast. We've got a president who's publicly said Cuba is next after Venezuela. We've got the Pentagon standing up a brand new permanent command structure for the entire Western Hemisphere. And we've got new sanctions dropping just last week on Cuban military officials with direct ties to Russia and China. And after we cover all of that, stick around because the global roundup today has some wild developments out of Ukraine and Russia that connect to this story more than you'd think. And then we'll wrap it all up in the 4D chess strategic analysis section, where we break down what Havana is actually terrified of versus what they're telling their own people. So let's get into it. To understand where we are right now, you've got to rewind to January 3rd of this year. That's the night U.S. forces launched the operation in Caracas that ended with Nicolas Maduro in American custody. Cuba's government, which had been propping up Venezuela's oil for loyalty arrangement for decades, watched that regime collapse in a matter of hours. And almost immediately, the fallout hit the island. Cuba's Ministry of Energy confirmed that dozens of their own security personnel had been killed in Venezuela during that operation, and Havana declared 2 full days of national mourning. That's how tied together these two governments were. When Maduro went down, Cuba didn't just lose an ally, it lost its fuel lifeline, because Venezuela had been shipping subsidized oil to Cuba for years to keep the lights on. So what did Washington do next? They didn't wait. Within weeks, the Trump administration slapped sanctions on oil shipments heading to the island, and by the end of January, an executive order was signed threatening tariffs on any country that dared to ship fuel to Cuba. Mexico, which had quietly been helping fill the gap through state-owned Pemex, suspended its shipments by the end of that same month. Think about that for a second. 2 of Cuba's remaining fuel lifelines got cut off within 30 days of each other. That's not a slow squeeze, that's basically kicking out both legs of a chair at the same time. And the effects showed up fast. By May, Cuba's own energy minister was going on record saying the country had essentially run dry of oil and diesel. Not running low, run dry. This is a nation of about 10 million people, and by the middle of this year, they had already suffered 6 complete national power grid collapses, 3 of them in the month of July alone. Imagine losing electricity across your entire country, not for an hour, not for a rolling blackout, but a full grid collapse, and having that happen 3 times in 30 days. Hospitals running on generators, water pumps that need electricity to function going dark, refrigeration for food and medicine gone. That's the kind of pressure that doesn't just weaken a government, it starts cracking the foundation underneath it. Now here's where it gets interesting because while the economic pressure was tightening, the military pieces started moving into place almost like clockwork. And if you know anything about how this administration operates, you know the economic squeeze and the military posture are never really separate tracks. They run together. Back in May, a Navy official confirmed that the USS Nimitz, a full aircraft carrier with its strike group of guided missile destroyers, radar jamming aircraft, and fighter squadrons, had been authorized for a naval buildup specifically tied to the Cuba situation. That's not a training exercise. That's the same playbook, almost to the letter, that was used in the lead-up to the Venezuela operation. Surveillance flights ramp up. A carrier gets positioned. Rhetoric from the top gets louder. And sure enough, in a Miami summit back in March, President Trump told the crowd directly that Cuba was next. Not implied, not hinted at. He said the word next out loud in public at a podium. By late May, the Marine and Navy presence in the Caribbean had grown to roughly 1,300 additional personnel, folding into a larger force that was already operating in the region under what had been called Operation Southern Spear. If you've been watching this channel, you already know about Southern Spear, the counter-narcotics and counter-cartel campaign that's been striking drug boats up and down the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific for the better part of a year. But something happened just a couple weeks before this current escalation that almost nobody outside of defense circles picked up on. Southern Command quietly shut down the Southern Spear Task Force and immediately stood up something new in its place called Joint Task Force Western Hemisphere. It's not a rebrand. That's a fundamental shift. Southern Spear was built to hunt drug boats. Western Hemisphere Command is built to run an entire region, full-time, permanently. Temporary became permanent. And when a temporary counter-drug operation gets replaced by a standing 4-star headquarters with its own hazardous material response teams, counter-drone operations, and even military working dog units, that tells you the Pentagon isn't planning for a 6-month mission. They're planning for the long haul, and Cuba sits right in the middle of that map. Now let's talk about the Marines specifically, because this is where it gets tangible. By late May, roughly 1,300 Marines and sailors operating under something called Littoral Combat Force 24 had taken over duties in the Caribbean from the previous rotation, the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. These Marines have been conducting fast rope insertion drills straight out of helicopters at Guantanamo Bay, just a handful of miles from actual Cuban territory. Think about the message that sends: you're not doing fast rope training exercises at a base that close to a hostile government's mainland unless you want that government's intelligence services watching every single rep. And on the same day those insertion drills were happening, the commanding general of Southern Command sat down face-to-face with Cuba's own first deputy minister and chief of the general staff. Both sides called the meeting positive, which, translated out of diplomat speak, usually means somebody delivered a message that nobody wants printed word for word. And what triggered a lot of this stepped-up posture wasn't just economic collapse on the island. It was an intelligence assessment that came out earlier this year showing Cuba had acquired more than 300 military drones from Russia and Iran since 2023. 300 drones. And the assessment specifically flagged scenarios where those drones could be used against Guantanamo Bay itself, against American naval vessels operating in the region, or even reaching as far as Key West. That's not some far-off hypothetical anymore. That's the kind of report that makes a Pentagon planner sit up straight in his chair. Because remember, we've spent the better part of 2 years watching cheap, mass-produced drones completely rewrite the rules of modern warfare, whether that's in Ukraine or in the Red Sea. A government that's broke, desperate, and sitting on hundreds of Iranian and Russian-supplied drones just off the coast of South Florida is not a footnote. That's a live threat picture. Now in June, Secretary Hegseth made his own personal visit to Guantanamo Bay, and what he said there set the tone for everything that's followed since. He told reporters that Cuba's future was in the hands of the U.S. president and Cuban leadership, and that the Department of War stood ready for, in his words, any possible eventuality. He also had a message specifically about threats against Americans, warning the regime not to try anything against U.S. citizens or territory, closing with a blunt, "Don't play that game." And he referenced the Venezuela operation directly as a precedent, which, if you're Havana, is about as subtle as someone showing you the receipt right before they walk into your store. Then last week, on August 7th, the Treasury Department dropped a fresh round of sanctions, this time targeting 8 additional Cuban officials, specifically high-ranking military figures with documented ties to Russia and China. This isn't random. This is surgical. When you sanction military leadership by name instead of just hitting the broader economy, you're sending a message directly to the people who actually control tanks, jets, and air defense systems, telling them their personal financial lifelines are now on the chopping block too. It's the kind of pressure designed to make a general start wondering if loyalty to a collapsing regime is really worth losing access to his own money. And then 2 days ago, everything crystallized in Panama. Secretary Hegseth was there for the wrap-up of Panamax 2026, a massive multinational military exercise, 18 partner nations training together to defend the Panama Canal and rehearse combined operations against threats in the hemisphere. While he was there, a reporter asked him directly whether there was a military option for Cuba on the table, and Hegseth didn't dodge it. He said, and I'm paraphrasing closely here, that just like in other scenarios we've all seen play out, every option remains on the table, including military ones, and that Cuba would be wise to pay close attention to the president's willingness to protect American strategic interests. He went further, saying the way countries across the hemisphere have aligned themselves with the United States shows they understand exactly where the balance of power sits right now, and that this applies to Cuba just as much as anyone else. He closed by saying there would be many options available going forward, and that Washington was, in his words, looking forward to what comes next. Now, I want to be straight with you here, because good analysis means giving you the full picture, not just the parts that make for the most dramatic headline. Just yesterday, Bloomberg reported, citing people familiar with internal discussions, that the administration's actual near-term Cuba strategy is leaning more toward ramping up sanctions and economic pressure rather than pulling the trigger on a military operation similar to the Venezuela raid. The reporting suggests the real objective right now is creating internal fractures within Cuba's own government and military ranks, essentially trying to squeeze the regime hard enough economically that it starts cracking apart from the inside without needing to send in a single Marine. And that's actually a really important distinction because it tells you the sequencing here. You don't need to invade a country if you can convince its own generals that the ship is sinking and it's time to jump. So while the rhetoric out of Panama sounds like war drums, the strategy playing out behind the scenes looks a lot more like a slow-motion economic siege, with the military option sitting loaded in the background as leverage, not necessarily as the next scheduled move. But here's the thing about leverage. It only works if the other side believes you'll actually use it. And that's exactly why you're seeing Hegseth talk tough in Panama, why you're seeing Marines conducting insertion drills a few miles from Cuban soil, why you're seeing a carrier strike group positioned in the region. It's not necessarily that the invasion order is sitting on a desk waiting for a signature. It's that Havana has to genuinely believe it could be, because the moment a cornered regime stops believing the threat is real, all your economic leverage evaporates overnight. All right, before we keep going, if you're finding this breakdown useful, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because we cover stories like this the moment they develop, connecting the dots between the economic pressure, the military movements, and what it actually means, instead of just repeating a headline at you. It genuinely helps the channel grow when you do that, so I appreciate every one of you who takes 2 seconds to do it. All right, let's keep rolling. So let's talk about what Cuba's own leadership has actually been saying to their people through all of this, because it tells you a lot about where their heads are at. President Miguel Diaz-Canel, back on May Day of this year, stood in front of a crowd and declared that the country was ready. And he said this with what he called profound conviction that he'd shared even with his own family to give their lives for the revolution. That's not the language of a confident government managing a rough patch. That's the language of a regime that knows exactly how precarious its position has become and is trying to rally a population that's dealing with rolling blackouts and empty gas stations into believing this is some kind of noble last stand. Meanwhile, Cuban officials have been publicly calling the American blockade an act of genocide, drawing comparisons to humanitarian crises happening elsewhere in the world, which, look, I get the propaganda value of that kind of language, but when your own energy minister is on record admitting the country has literally run out of diesel, you don't need to reach for dramatic comparisons. The numbers speak for themselves. And this is where the honesty check comes in, because there's a pattern here that should sound familiar if you've been watching this channel cover Iran or Venezuela. When a government starts loudly proclaiming they're ready to die for the cause, what they're usually doing is managing morale on the inside, while quietly hoping the outside world blinks first. Meanwhile, back in May, something happened that got almost no coverage, but tells you everything about where the real conversation is actually happening. CIA Director John Ratcliffe made a rare direct trip to Havana for a face-to-face meeting with senior Cuban officials. Now think about that. The head of America's premier intelligence agency doesn't fly to a hostile capital for a courtesy visit. That trip was almost certainly used to deliver a very specific message, likely some combination of, here's what we know about your internal situation, and here's what happens if this goes a certain direction. Public rhetoric says defiance. Private channels say something very different, and that gap between the two is usually where the real story lives. There's also the Raul Castro piece of this, which is honestly one of the boldest moves the Justice Department has made in this entire saga. Back in May, U.S. prosecutors announced criminal indictments against former Cuban leader Raul Castro himself, along with several other officials tied to the 1996 shoot-down of 2 civilian aircraft operated by a Cuban exile group, an incident that killed 4 people flying unarmed planes over international waters. That case has been sitting dormant for nearly 3 decades. Reviving it now, publicly, naming Castro directly, is a message with layers to it. It's legal pressure, it's historical accountability, and frankly, it's psychological warfare aimed squarely at a family name that has represented the Cuban Revolution for over 60 years. You don't indict a symbol like that unless you want the whole world, and every officer inside Cuba's own military, to see that even the untouchables aren't untouchable anymore. Now let's shift and talk about the actual hardware sitting in the neighborhood right now, because this is the part where you start to understand just how lopsided this matchup would be if it ever actually came to blows. Cuba's military, by any honest assessment, is a shell of what it was during the Cold War. Back when the Soviets were bankrolling the island, Cuba had a genuinely formidable regional force. Today, most of that equipment is decades old, poorly maintained, and running on spare parts that stopped being manufactured before a lot of the people watching this video were even born. Cuba has essentially no functioning navy to speak of, a handful of aging patrol boats that couldn't stand up to a single American guided missile destroyer, let alone an entire carrier strike group. Their air defenses have been neglected for so long that most assessments put them somewhere between weak and symbolic. And that matters, because if you look at how the Iran conflict played out earlier this year, remember, we covered this extensively on this channel. The coalition wiped out the remnants of Iranian air defenses within the first 4 or 5 days of that campaign. Once that happens, you own the sky, and once you own the sky, you get to fly cheaper, more plentiful munitions instead of burning through your most expensive long-range missiles. If Cuban air defenses are even weaker than Iran's were, and by most accounts they are, that timeline would likely be even shorter. Sitting off the coast right now, the United States has maintained a persistent naval presence in the Caribbean that, at points over the last year, has included as many as 11 warships and roughly 10,000 personnel. That's not a light footprint. The USS Gerald R. Ford, arguably the most advanced aircraft carrier on the planet, spent months operating in this exact region as part of Southern Spear, putting one of the crown jewels of American naval aviation within visual range of the entire Southern Caribbean. And now you're adding the Nimitz-class carrier movement into the mix, specifically tied to Cuba, along with the littoral combat force Marines running amphibious insertion drills a stone's throw from Guantanamo. Layer on top of that the fact that Cuba sits close enough to multiple air bases in the continental United States that Washington wouldn't even need to rely purely on carrier aviation. Fighters could theoretically launch from Florida, hit a target, and be back on the ground before some of these Cuban air defense operators finish their coffee. And here's a detail that's easy to miss if you're not paying close attention to the diplomatic side of this. Colombia, during that same Panama meeting, formally authorized joint military operations with the United States against groups designated as terrorist organizations, becoming essentially the 19th partner nation locked into this broader hemispheric security framework. 19 countries. That's not just Panama and the usual suspects anymore. That's Argentina, Brazil, Chile, the Dominican Republic, most of Central America, and even partners from outside the hemisphere entirely like the Netherlands and the UK showing up to train in jungle warfare conditions that mirror exactly what a Caribbean or Cuban contingency would look like. When you build a coalition that wide, you're not just projecting military capability. You're building the political cover to act, because the last thing any administration wants is to move unilaterally and get hammered internationally for it. 19 flags standing behind you changes that calculus entirely. Let's also talk about the Jungle Operations Training Center in Panama specifically, because Hegseth made a point of visiting it personally during this trip and posting about it. That facility, revived last fall after being shut down back in 1999, exists to train American and Allied troops in dense, tropical, high-humidity combat environments. Exactly the kind of terrain you'd find across most of Cuba. You don't reopen a jungle warfare school that had been mothballed for over 2 decades unless you're anticipating operations in terrain that actually requires it. Hegseth's own quote from the visit was that no environment is too hostile and no terrain too challenging for the warriors training there, and while that's obviously meant to be an inspirational soundbite, it's also functionally a training pipeline being stood back up right, as tensions with the one Caribbean nation whose terrain most closely matches that description happen to be spiking. Coincidence? Maybe. But this administration doesn't exactly have a track record of coincidences when it comes to this stuff. Now here's the honest question nobody's really asking out loud, and it's the one that actually matters most. If the United States wanted to, could they topple Cuba's government the same way they toppled Maduro's? Almost certainly yes, and probably faster, given how much weaker Cuba's conventional military is compared to what Venezuela had on paper. The real question isn't capability, it's whether Washington actually wants to own what comes after. Cuba is a nation of 10 million people already suffering under grid collapses and fuel shortages. A military intervention doesn't just remove a government, it inherits a humanitarian crisis, potentially a wave of migration toward Florida that would make previous boat lift crises look small by comparison, and a post-collapse political vacuum that history tells us can get messy fast. That's likely a huge part of why the Bloomberg reporting suggests the administration is currently favoring the slow squeeze over the sudden strike. It's not that the military option isn't real. It's that using economic pressure to engineer an internal collapse, one where Cuban officials themselves decide continuing to prop up a dying regime isn't worth it anymore, is a cleaner outcome than owning a full-blown intervention and everything that comes with it. You made it to the global roundup section, my friend? So let's jump around the world for a second and connect a few other dots, because there's a thread here worth pulling. Overnight, Ukraine hit Russia's Progress rocket and space center way out in the Samara region, using their own domestically built Flamingo cruise missiles, describing the facility as one of Roscosmos's key manufacturing sites, tied to electronics production for Russian missile systems. They also struck an airbase in the Nizhny Novgorod region that Ukrainian officials say has been used to launch aircraft involved in missile attacks on Ukrainian cities, along with an oil facility right up near the Estonian border. Meanwhile, Russia's own defense ministry claimed they hit a railway station in the Ukrainian port town of Izmail, alleging it was being used to move military cargo and fuel, and struck vessels near Mykolaiv. This tit-for-tat deep strike campaign has been escalating for weeks now, with both sides reaching further and further behind the actual front lines, hitting economic infrastructure, energy hubs, and manufacturing centers, instead of just trading artillery along a static line. And here's the piece that ties back to everything we just talked about with Cuba. This is the exact same playbook. Cut off your adversary's fuel, cripple their infrastructure, squeeze their economy until internal pressure does work that soldiers on a battlefield can't. Whether it's Ukraine hammering Russian oil terminals or Washington choking off tankers headed to Havana, the strategic logic underneath both situations is identical. Energy is the pressure point of the 21st century, and everybody with a military budget has figured that out. There's also a broader story unfolding on the ground in Ukraine right now that's worth mentioning. Kyiv announced they successfully wrapped up an operation reclaiming roughly 745 square kilometers of territory in the southern Dnipropetrovsk region, an area Russia had pushed into back in the summer of last year. Ukrainian officials say almost 10,000 Russian soldiers were killed or lost in that campaign, and independent assessments now put Russia's net territorial gain across the entire front at a loss for the year so far, despite continued Russian offensives around Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. So even as Russian missile strikes intensify against Ukrainian cities that are increasingly defenseless as Patriot interceptor stockpiles run thin, Ukraine has actually managed to claw back ground on the map. It's a reminder that battlefield momentum and headline-grabbing missile exchanges don't always tell the same story, and it's exactly the kind of nuance you need to actually understand a conflict instead of just reacting to the scariest clip on your timeline that day. That brings us to the 4D chess strategic analysis section, my friends. So let's put this whole board together, because underneath all the individual headlines, there's one clear through line. Every move Washington has made toward Cuba over the last several months follows the same sequencing we've now watched play out in Venezuela, and in a very different form in Iran. Step 1, isolate the target economically, specifically targeting the energy supply, because energy is the one resource a modern government simply cannot function without. Step 2, build a credible, visible military presence in the region, not necessarily to use immediately, but to make the threat of force real enough that it changes the target regime's internal calculations. Step 3, build international coalition cover so that whatever comes next doesn't look like unilateral aggression, but rather a broad hemispheric consensus. And step 4, apply targeted pressure directly against the individuals who actually hold power, sanctioning military leadership by name, reviving decades-old indictments against symbolic figures like Raul Castro, essentially making it personally and financially painful for anyone inside the regime to keep standing behind it. What Cuba actually needs right now isn't a symbolic act of defiance from Diaz-Canel on a stage during a May Day rally. What they need is fuel, foreign currency, and a functioning economy, and none of their remaining allies, Russia, China, or whoever else might want to prop them up, are in any real position to fill that gap the way Venezuela used to. Russia is fully consumed fighting a grinding war in Ukraine and dealing with deep strikes on its own energy infrastructure. The same story we just covered in the global roundup. China, for all their rhetoric about South-South solidarity, has shown zero appetite for directly antagonizing Washington over a small Caribbean island when they've got their own economic and geopolitical priorities to juggle in the Pacific. So Cuba is essentially standing alone, publicly declaring readiness to sacrifice everything for the revolution, while privately, if the Bloomberg reporting and the Ratcliffe visit tell us anything, there are almost certainly back-channel conversations happening about what an off-ramp might actually look like. And here's the irony that closes the loop on this whole story. The louder Havana talks about resisting American aggression, the more it actually validates just how effective the pressure campaign has become. You don't declare you're ready to die for a cause unless the alternative, in this case, watching your own government run out of options entirely, feels like the more realistic outcome. Meanwhile, every jungle warfare drill in Panama, every fast rope insertion at Guantanamo, every additional sanctioned general adds one more brick to a wall that Havana simply doesn't have the resources to climb over. Whether the actual endgame here ends up being a Maduro-style extraction operation, a negotiated transition brokered quietly through channels like the one Ratcliffe opened up, or simply a slow economic strangulation that causes the regime to collapse from internal fractures without a single American boot needing to hit Cuban soil, one thing seems increasingly clear. The status quo that's protected Cuba's government for over 60 years is not holding, and Washington knows it, Havana knows it, and at this point, honestly, most of the world watching this unfold knows it too. So what do you think happens next? Does Washington actually pull the trigger on some version of a Venezuela-style operation, or does the economic squeeze do the job on its own without a single shot being fired? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to read your take on this one, especially if you've got family or connections tied to the region, because your perspective adds a lot to these discussions. And if this kind of deep dive breakdown is useful to you, go ahead and share it with somebody who'd want to understand what's actually happening here instead of just skimming a headline. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.